August 19th, 2026. Write it down, circle it, set an alarm. Because on that morning, a 50% tariff lands on nearly $20 billion of Canadian goods, all at once, no grace period, no soft landing. And right now, one man in Ontario is done being polite about it. Doug Ford just pointed at America's single most exposed supply chain and said, out loud, that Canada could pull the plug on it. That supply chain is potash. You've probably never given it a second thought in your life. You're about to. Potash is the fertilizer that keeps American farmland productive at industrial scale. Take it away, and yields drop, costs spike, and grocery prices follow. Not eventually, fast. Here's the number that should stop you mid-scroll. The United States gets roughly 79% of its potash from one single country. 79%. That's not a trade relationship. That's a dependency with a pressure point. And Doug Ford just put his thumb directly on it. If you want the real story behind the headlines, the ones with actual numbers, not just outrage, subscribe now, because this situation is moving fast and most people are going to miss it entirely. Let's go back to where this actually started, because it wasn't August 19th. It was July 20th at the World Cup final in New Jersey. President Trump sat beside Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney that afternoon. Hours later, the announcement dropped. 50% tariffs on the bulk of Canadian goods, effective in 30 days. The legal tool behind it has a name most people have never heard. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. Wall Street knows it well. It lets a president tariff a country he determines is treating American trade unfairly. The administration's case, Canada discriminates against U.S. exporters across multiple sectors. The legal ceiling under that statute is 50%. Trump didn't ease into it. He went straight to the cap. That's not a warning shot fired into the air. That's every round in the chamber spent at once. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle anyone who thought trade treaties meant something permanent. These tariffs apply even to goods that are fully compliant with the USMCA, the very agreement designed to protect them. Read that twice. The treaty isn't the shield people assumed it was, not when a president reaches for emergency trade authority instead. The administration's own justification is blunt. Canada, they argue, imposes quotas on American-made vehicles that no other trading partner faces. The result, according to their numbers, from April 2025 to March 2026, Canadian imports of U.S. vehicles dropped by roughly 22%. That's $5.6 billion in lost auto trade in a single year. That's the figure Washington points to as the justification for going nuclear on trade policy. Canada, predictably, sees this entire picture through a completely different lens. Canadian trade officials didn't wait around. They were in Washington by July 29th for emergency talks trying to stop the countdown before it hit zero. But here's what most of the coverage is missing. Neither side has meaningfully moved since those meetings. Ottawa maintains it isn't discriminating against American trade the way Washington claims. Washington maintains the $5.6 billion figure speaks for itself. Both sides are entrenched, and the deadline doesn't care who's right. So why does this matter to you, specifically, sitting wherever you're sitting right now? Because this was never really a Canada story. It's a your grocery bill story. Tariffs get paid by importers first, but the cost never stays there. Importers pass it to retailers. Retailers pass it to you. In 2025 alone, tariff policy already added roughly $1,000 to the average American household's costs. Early estimates for 2026 put the additional burden near $900 more. That's real money. Money that used to go toward groceries, gas, savings, your kids. Now quietly redirected toward the cost of trade politics. And potash sits right at the center of the quietest version of that squeeze. If Canada restricts potash exports the way Ford has floated, American farmers lose access to it. Fertilizer prices spike. Crop input costs rise. And eventually that shows up on a grocery store shelf near you, with absolutely no line item explaining why. That's the part nobody talks about at the dinner table. Nobody sees tariff surcharge printed on the grocery receipt. But the price of bread, cereal, and produce reflects it anyway. That's how this actually works in the real economy, not the headline version. It never announces itself. It just quietly raises the cost of living. So, where does this actually go from here? Realistically, there are three paths, and each one changes the outcome for you differently. Path 1, Canada makes concessions, and the tariff gets delayed or reduced. Path 2, nothing changes, and the full 50% hits exactly as scheduled. Path 3, Canada retaliates hard, potash restrictions included. History offers a clue, but not a guarantee. Trump has used deadline pressure before, in both terms. Sometimes deals land in the final hours. Sometimes the tariffs simply go into effect exactly as threatened. Back in early 2025, Mexico struck a last-minute deal just before its own deadline. Canada has done both, before it's negotiated in some standoffs, absorbed the hit in others. This time feels different because Section 338 has a hard ceiling. There's no more room to escalate under this specific authority. Trump is already at the maximum. The only moves left from here are political. Which brings us right back to Doug Ford and that potash threat. If Canada plays its strongest card, expect export restrictions on potash to be the opening move. It's the one lever that hits American consumers directly, and fast. Farmers would feel it within a single growing season, not years down the line. And farmers are one of the most politically sensitive voting blocs in America. Ford knows exactly where the pressure point sits. This entire standoff is a high-stakes game of economic chicken, and both sides know the other holds something that genuinely hurts. The only question left is who blinks first, and how much damage lands before they do. Now let's rewind to what happened after the July 20th headlines faded, because the real story isn't the announcement, it's everything that came after. On July 23rd, Prime Minister Carney gathered all 13 provincial premiers in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, for 3 tense days of closed-door strategy. Ford didn't hold back for a second. He told reporters plainly that Canada could dismantle American supply chains if it chose to. And his weapon of choice was, again, potash, paired this time with Canadian oil exports. His stance? Match every tariff, dollar for dollar. Carney's tone was more measured but no less firm. Everything is on the table, he said, depending on how talks go. That phrase is doing a lot of quiet work. It signals Canada hasn't ruled out a direct 50% counter tariff, but it also hasn't committed publicly to anything specific. That ambiguity is deliberate. It keeps Washington guessing about the real level of risk. Here's something most coverage completely skips. Potash itself isn't actually targeted by the new Section 338 tariff. Energy, potash, fish, and critical minerals are specifically carved out of that action. So why does Ford keep bringing it up? Because it's Canada's leverage, not America's target. It's the retaliation card, not the thing being taxed. Ford has the number memorized. 79% of U.S. potash comes from Canada. That's not a talking point. It's a structural supply chain dependency you cannot simply replace overnight. Rebuilding fertilizer supply chains takes years, not weeks. That's exactly why he sees it as Canada's single strongest countermeasure available. But not every premier agrees, and that split matters just as much as the threat itself. Alberta's Danielle Smith has pushed back hard against retaliatory tariffs, especially anything touching oil. Saskatchewan has historically favored diplomacy over confrontation. British Columbia's premier said his province stood ready if called upon but stopped short of endorsing Ford's approach outright. Canada, in other words, isn't speaking with one voice here. It's a coalition under real internal strain, and a fractured response is objectively weaker leverage than a unified one. Washington's negotiators almost certainly know this, and it likely shapes how hard they're willing to push. Here's where this becomes relevant if you're managing real money, and not just watching the news scroll by. This isn't the first Canada-US tariff fight, not even close. Back in March 2025, Canada matched US tariffs with its own 25% retaliation, catching steel and aluminum producers in the crossfire. So there's precedent. Canada has matched tariffs dollar for dollar before, and it can do it again. The real question for anyone with exposure is which sectors take the hit this time. Steel and aluminum producers have already lived through one round of this. Auto manufacturers with cross-border supply chains felt real pain the last time. And now, fertilizer-dependent agriculture sits squarely in the new crossfire for the first time. If you hold positions in fertilizer producers, this deadline deserves your attention. Same if you're exposed to auto sector supply chains with Canadian ties, or energy names tied to Canadian oil exports. This is exactly the kind of macro event that repricing entire sectors fast, not because the underlying fundamentals shifted, but because the political risk premium just spiked overnight. Markets generally hate uncertainty more than they hate bad news. A confirmed 50% tariff is bad, but at least it's known and already priced in. An open-ended retaliation threat involving fertilizer and energy is genuinely harder to model, and that unpredictability is exactly what's kept trade lawyers busy all summer. One compliance advisory put it bluntly: don't assume your USMCA paperwork protects you. A valid certificate of origin does not automatically exempt goods from this tariff. That's a critical detail for any business shipping across the border after August 19th. Landed cost calculations are being rerun right now, in real time, across entire industries. When that kind of operational scramble hits supply chains, it eventually shows up in earnings. Watch Q3 and Q4 guidance from any company with cross-border exposure. CFOs tend to flag this kind of risk quietly, months before it becomes a headline. Meanwhile, the diplomatic track hasn't gone cold. Canadian officials were in Washington on July 29 for what's been described as intensive talks, though no breakthrough has been confirmed. Carney has framed this, so far, as a time to talk rather than a time to strike back. That framing matters. It suggests Canada hasn't fully committed to retaliation, at least not publicly. But Ford's pressure campaign isn't just aimed at Washington, it's aimed at his own government too. That's an underappreciated dynamic here. Domestic political pressure inside Canada could end up shaping the outcome just as much as anything coming out of the White House. If Ford's harder line gains public support, Carney faces real pressure to match it. If Canadians lean toward the diplomatic path, Carney gets more room to negotiate quietly, out of the spotlight. And there's still the coordination problem. For retaliation to work as genuine leverage, it needs to look like one unified national policy, not a patchwork of individual provinces going their own way. That coordination gap might be Canada's biggest internal obstacle heading into the deadline. But clock, of course, doesn't wait for any of that to get resolved. Every day without an agreement is another day closer to the full 50% tariff taking effect. And once tariffs go live, walking them back gets politically harder, not easier. No president wants to be seen backing down publicly. That alone makes a last-minute reversal less likely than most people assume. So what does this actually mean if you're trying to protect a portfolio through it? Let's get concrete, because vague warnings help nobody. First, know your exposure. Go sector by sector. Fertilizer producers, auto parts suppliers, and cross-border logistics firms all carry direct risk here. The world's largest potash producer sits right at the center of this story, and if Canada restricts exports, that company's pricing power could shift dramatically, almost overnight. But here's the nuance most headlines miss. Restricted supply often means higher prices for whoever's still holding inventory. A potash export risk region. Second, watch the currency. Trade tension has historically weakened the Canadian dollar, which partially offsets tariff costs by making Canadian exports cheaper. It's a built-in economic stabilizer worth tracking closely right now. Third, watch agricultural futures. Corn, wheat, and soybean contracts respond fast to fertilizer input costs, often showing up in futures pricing months before it ever reaches a store shelf. Fourth, and often overlooked, regional bank exposure to agricultural lending. Farm Belt banks carry concentrated loan books tied directly to crop input costs. A fertilizer price shock doesn't stay contained to one sector, it ripples into rural lending, insurance pricing, and local economic activity broadly. Fifth, keep an eye on steel and aluminum given the 2025 precedent. Canada matched US tariffs on those metals dollar for dollar once already. There's no strong reason to assume this round looks fundamentally different. Now zoom out, because individual stock picks were never really the point. The bigger lesson here is about how trade policy risk gets priced going forward. For years, investors treated the USMCA as a stable, predictable framework. This standoff is proof that even treaty-protected goods aren't fully insulated anymore. That's a structural shift in how much certainty any trade agreement actually provides. And smart investors are already adjusting their risk premiums accordingly. It also means paying closer attention to presidential trade authority specifically, not just Congress. These executive tools move faster than ordinary trade law. 30 days from announcement to deadline, in this case. That's barely enough time for most companies to adjust sourcing, let alone renegotiate long-term supply contracts. That mismatch between policy speed and business planning speed is a real, structural risk, and it's worth remembering the next time a threat like this drops, because based on the patterns so far, this almost no trade policy at this point isn't a background issue anymore. It's an active, live, market-moving tool, and that's the real takeaway that outlasts this specific deadline. Back to the immediate situation, because 3 weeks is still 3 weeks. Talks continue. No breakthrough has been confirmed as of the latest reporting. Carney continues framing this as a moment for dialogue. Ford continues pushing publicly for the harder line. That internal tension inside Canada hasn't resolved, and it might not resolve before the deadline arrives. If Carney's approach wins out, expect a possible last-minute adjustment. If Ford's harder line gains the upper hand, expect matched retaliation, Potash included. Either path creates real, tradable volatility across every sector we've covered here. That's exactly why this date belongs on your calendar. Set the reminder for August 19th, and watch the week that follows closely. Earnings calls in late August and September will reveal how companies are actually adjusting, and CFO commentary in that window tends to be more honest than the headlines that come before it. So here's the bottom line, stripped of noise and stripped of political framing. America depends on Canada for roughly 79% of its potash supply. Canada is actively weighing whether to use that dependency as leverage. Trump has already imposed the legal maximum under Section 388. 30 days from announcement puts the effective date at August 19, 2026. 13 Canadian premiers remain divided on how hard to respond, and global supply chains from fertilizer to autos sit directly in the crossfire. That's not speculation. That's where the facts stand today. In 3 weeks, we'll know which direction this actually went. Until then, watch the data, not the noise, and position yourself accordingly. If this breakdown helped you see the real risk behind the headlines, hit subscribe. Drop a comment and tell me which sector you're watching most closely right now. This channel exists to cut through the noise and get you the numbers that actually matter, deadline after deadline. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next breakdown.